is great to see you. And
Hey,
I'm
Vicky.
so excited to be talking with you about what our book looks like as we move forward. Because I think that when we wrote this book 4 years ago, when we started writing this book, we did not imagine it would come out in this moment when people are talking about defunding the police and abolition in a really serious and thoughtful and widespread way.
Yeah. When we started writing this book, Obama was president, and we
Mhm.
were writing it out of a desire to pull people away from reforms that would actually expand the prison industrial complex. So there have been lots of ups and downs, but that has remained constant, I think, is that push by centrist and mainstream and conservative and liberal forces to implement reforms that are actually going to expand the prison industrial complex. And right now we're in the midst of a really powerful movement that is rejecting that.
We are. But we also, at the same time, see some of the reforms that we caution about being used, being brought up as alternatives to either alternatives to defunding the police and also as alternatives to policing. And again, I feel like our book perhaps could not have come into the world at a better time when there is that space to challenge uh, the reforms that are being proposed. And there's also the space in which people are more receptive to listening to these concerns and pushing back and saying, what would community safety and interpersonal safety and safety from state violence look like if we are not relying on these failed systems?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think on the one hand, we've heard politicians, including Joe Biden and people very high up in the Democratic Party at the city and state and federal level, saying, okay, we're not defunding the police, we're funding the police better.
Mhm.
We're using community policing. We're going to use predictive policing strategies based on data so they can't possibly be racially biased. And of course, in our book, we specifically warn against expanding community policing, which is basically expanding the police, putting more police on the streets, heightening the way in which policing infiltrates society, and of course is built on this grounding of white supremacy and anti-blackness. So expanding the police means expanding the reach of those forces too. And so in this moment, we're hearing that, and then we're hearing this revolutionary call to defund the police on the way to abolition. We're hearing abolition so much
Yes.
in in public discourse in a way that I don't think we could have imagined 4.5 years ago.
Yes. No, when we first thought about this book, we thought about this as pushing back against a relatively small but growing group of people who are looking at ends to mass incarceration. We weren't looking at this as lots of people are going to be suddenly thinking about abolition, not as a pie in the sky dream off in the future, but as something to work towards in the here and now. So that is extremely, extremely exciting to see our book come out in this moment, but also to see that people are able to use this as an organizing tool. So we're seeing that people are having reading groups around our book, um, not just in small radical spaces, but the Brooklyn Public Library is having a reading group of our book in January. So that brings these ideas to a wider swath of people than might normally be thinking about decarceration, defunding police, abolition, and again, asking themselves if we are going to have a world in which we have defunded the police and defunded these death making institutions, what would safety look like? And how do we transform our societies to do that?
Exactly. And I think that some of the easy solutions that are being put forth by policymakers, like we'll replace the police with social workers, we
Hmm.
will replace prison with electronic monitoring. Those are things we've been calling people to rethink and say, we don't want anyone doing policing. We don't want anyone caging people and exerting social and racial control. And when we think about social workers, I think there's this sense that social workers are an indisputably benevolent force in society, which of course some social workers are benevolent forces, but we also see social work as one of the main ingredients of the child protective services system, which punishes and tears apart families and communities through the foster care system. And we see that system doing policing and implementing the kind of punishment that is some of the most harsh punishment in the world, which is tearing people away from their children. And of course, that system also grew out of colonialism, grew out of slavery. And so we're calling people to imagine bigger, which of course is also what the Black Lives Matter movement and the defund police movement are also calling for in this moment.
Yes. And I think it's important for people to remember that when we're calling for more services and services that are social work based or social services, such as, more counselors, more mental health services, more people that we think of as being in the helpful professions, there's a danger of shifting to social work without eliminating the policing mentality that is inherent in social work. So you talked about how social workers are a pipeline into foster care for low income families of color, particularly low income Black families and Black families headed by Black mothers. And we see again and again and again that child welfare officials and social workers often see Black mothers and other low income mothers of color or mothers of color in general as somehow less fit mothers than they would their white counterparts, even if they are engaging in the exact same behaviors and living in the exact same circumstances and are in the same socioeconomic brackets. Um, and what we see in that is that they tend to call policing and other systems into play more for low income families of color. They tend to replicate policing in that way. The same biases that are inherent in policing are inherent in many of the social work practices. And we're also seeing that there more and more are laws that require people to become mandatory reporters. Mandatory reporting being that if you suspect child abuse or child neglect, you must report it to child welfare agencies. And child neglect can be something as relatively benign as the child shows up to school wearing the same clothes 3 days in a row. The child is hungry. The child is dirty. The family lives in a building in which the landlord is not providing heat or perhaps has not fixed the hallways. So the hallways are in disrepair and could potentially be dangerous. But rather than putting the onus on the landlord for not fixing the building or on the school for not providing meals or asking, what can we do to help? Instead, there is a threat of punishment in which child welfare officials then visit the parent's house and say, we have noticed that your child is wearing the same clothes, appears to be hungry. We've noticed your hallways are full of lead paint and your heat doesn't seem to be on. And instead of saying, what services can we hook you up with so that that way we can fix these conditions, they say, if you, family, caregiver, parent, do not fix these conditions, we will take your child away. And so it puts the onus on the individual parent with the idea that this person does not care enough about their child or their children to be providing these things. And if they do not magically fight all the forces of capitalism that force them to live in substandard housing, not be able to afford a lot of food, perhaps not be able to do laundry or have enough clothes to go through the week, that they do not deserve to have their child, and their child should be taken away. And we see this again and again and again, and this becomes a pipeline into the foster care system. And there have been numerous studies that show children who languish in the foster care system are more likely to become entangled in the criminal legal system later on in life, not because they are inherently dangerous or terrible people, but because they have been lacking a lot of the resources and social supports that other people have had. So, again, to think about social work as replacing policing, we need to also think about the ways in which social work has been imbued with policing and surveillance at the same time. Because if we just replace police with social workers, we end up with what we have warned as kinder, gentler forms of surveillance and coercive control. So it may not be a police officer with a gun and a nightstick. It might be a social worker with a clipboard and an order to take a child away from their family.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the common elements that we're seeing in all of this, all of these suspect calls for reform, is coercion. And that's this go-to strategy, which we see even in Biden's calls and the Democratic platform's calls for mandated treatment as opposed to optional treatment for people with drug addictions. And this is seen as this kinder, gentler option as opposed to incarceration for people who are addicted to substances, to illicit substances. And so I think what we are hoping for is to call people to question coercion in that form as well. So looking at, okay, it's good that people are agreeing that incarceration is not the solution to addiction or to conditions that have been diagnosed as mental illness. It's good to recognize that explicit incarceration is not the solution, but also we have to dig deeper. We have to think about how are we just consenting to take away people's bodily autonomy and mental autonomy, and how are we actually targeting people with disabilities, people with different ways of operating and being in the world that might at this point be stigmatized or criminalized. And so this is a disability justice question. It's a question when it comes to thinking about addiction in particular. How can we actually support people? How can we actually provide resources for people? And it turns out when you look at both the studies, the research, and people's personal experience, you can see that you can't coerce someone into well-being. You can't coerce someone into survival. And so in our book, we also engage with harm reduction approaches, approaches to providing resources that are not mandated, not coercive, but instead trusting people to actually make decisions for themselves and their children and their families and their bodies and minds. And one of the things that I think we discovered in working with this book was all the ways in which diagnosis sometimes mirrors criminalization and is entangled with criminalization, and diagnosis is racialized, is related to ability and class and all of these elements that get erased because diagnosis is seen as science. And of course, we know that science itself is racialized and has been used as a tool of racism and of genocide. And so all of those elements, I think we need to be teasing out as well. And we always need to be asking questions. I feel like I personally went through sort of an evolution of challenging myself in writing this book and thinking, okay, what really is control? Are there things that I advocate and believe in that are actually about controlling people and coercing people? And so this is also a call to challenge our own mindsets as we go.
Yes. As Mariam Kaba, whom we interviewed for a good long time for our book at the very beginning of our research and writing of this book, has said you have to get the cops out of your hearts and minds. So I think that that's important for us. For that is an important takeaway. It is a good sort of like little bite-sized summary or soundbite for our book, which is you can't devise alternatives to this giant 2.2 million block of mass incarceration if you don't get the cops and this idea of surveillance and control out of your mind, because otherwise everything that you look at as a possible solution or a possible reform is going to be a lot like prison. So we talk about electronic monitoring, we talk about mandatory treatment, whether it's mandatory mental health treatment, mandatory drug treatment. We talk about these alternatives such as probation and sex offender registries and sex worker rescue programs, uh, these various forms of nicer policing, like community policing, neighborhood policing, uh, data policing, which, as you talked about in terms of science, people talk about science as being race neutral and gender neutral, and we know that it is not. We know that people have used science for a long time to back up their ideas, their racist and eugenicist ideas about uh, people, and what kinds of people are certain races, and what kinds of other ridiculous notions are used to justify racist policies and oppressions. And in the same way, we see that data is often held up as this neutral thing, but data is built on past policing experiences and past policing biases. So we see these connections in this. And at the heart of all of this is, again, this idea that people need to be policed, people need to be surveilled, people need to be controlled, people are not capable of being the arbitrators of their own bodies and well-being. And so when we talk about sending people to mandatory drug treatment or drug court or lockdown mental health units or subjecting them to medicalized mental health treatment, oftentimes what we're saying is we are deciding what is best for you, rather than having somebody say, I use drugs and this is actually not a problem for me. We, draw on the work of Dr. Carl Hart, who is a neuroscientist at Columbia University, and he is coming out with a book or just came out with a book in which he talks openly about being a drug user. Now, nobody thinks of the neuroscientist at Columbia University as somebody who openly talks about using drugs and says, I am openly using drugs and this has not affected my ability to do the work that I am doing, and to do this very cerebral brainiac type of work of neuroscience. And at the same time, I also engage in using these drugs that have been criminalized, and this has not affected my ability to be in the world. So mandating drug treatment or drug courts takes away that agency and says it doesn't matter whether or not you are, uh, functioning and going about your daily life and doing, and living your best life. We see this as a problem and this must be eradicated, even if it has actually not been a problem for you.
Yes. And I think we also see that people are often impeded from seeking
Mhm.
support for addiction and for psychiatric disabilities out of a justified fear that they'll be pulled into these systems and that their agency will be taken away and that they won't actually receive help, but will instead be either punished or controlled in a way that is going to make them feel worse.
Mm.
And we see these systems actually endangering people's survival in various ways because drug users are afraid to call 911 in
Mhm.
emergencies because they're worried about the police showing up
Mhm.
and criminalizing them. And so I think taking all these things into consideration as we're building solutions is so important and also helps us be creative in seeking solutions that are actually going to work, in seeking ways of living and being and building community in the world that are actually going to move us forward and toward freedom and liberation and safety and well-being.
Yes. And I'm glad that we ended our book on that note as well, where we talk about uh, solutions that communities have come up with. So this is not Vicky and Maya come down with the edict from above that says, thou shalt do these types of alternatives instead. It's what different people in different places facing different types of criminalization or potential punishments, but also needing to address problems in their community have come up with. And so we see this from support systems like the Icarus Project, which is now called something else, and I forget what it's called. So
Fireweed Collective, I
the
think.
Fireweed Collective. So we should, like to build support for each other. The SERO project, which works to address HIV criminalization, to grassroots groups like Build the Block in Oakland, where people in a specific neighborhood say, how can we create supports so that we don't have to call 911. And they're not trying to immediately tackle what do we do when somebody is murdered and we don't call 911, but how do we start the building process of building our community so that that way we don't have to call 911. And that is not our de facto uh, response to trying to address harm.
Exactly. And I think we also try to offer examples of how folks are dealing with some of the most difficult types of harm and
Mhm.
conflict and violence. So, the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective and Just Practice Collaborative, and groups that are working to address sexual violence and sexual
Mhm.
abuse, and thinking through how can we actually address what survivors need as opposed to feeding a system of criminalization. So I think lifting up those kinds of grassroots efforts as opposed to, as you mentioned, Vicky, trying to come up with another monolithic top down institution is really where we're going to be able to pursue a different society, one that's built on both safety and liberation. And I think also one of the things that we found in interviewing Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who was our other initial interview, in addition to Miriam Kava, was the sense that all of these things that we want, that we're working toward, we need to think about actually providing what people need, providing the support that everyone needs in our society in order to build communities that are not doing things that might be classified as crimes in order to survive. So thinking about how can we support people in surviving and thriving? How can we make sure everybody has healthcare and access to food and housing and education, access to the arts and recreation, and all of these things that we need to build a vibrant society. That's where we need to start. And we need to imagine that whole different society in order to imagine a society beyond these types of violence that we're discussing. And so, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, change everything.
Yes. I think that is the perfect note for us to leave off on. So I want to encourage viewers to uh, pick up a copy of our book. If you cannot afford the book, get your local library to order copies, because then you can also have a reading club with people in your neighborhood, and you can start brainstorming what safety looks like in your community, because every community is going to be different. I live in New York City, Maya is in Chicago. We live in different cities, we live in different types of neighborhoods, we have different living situations and circumstances, so safety looks different in different contexts, and we need to remember that we cannot talk about uh, replacing this giant block that is mass incarceration with another giant puzzle piece that just fits in. What we're doing instead is saying, how do we create safety, and then stitching together little, not little, but stitching together projects and programs and initiatives, and seeing what we can learn from each other and adapting them so that they fit our needs.
Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us for this conversation.
Yes, thanks so much for tuning in.